This is Steffen Schmidt for InsiderIowa.com. I was just checking my New York Times here this morning to catch up on the state visit by China's Vice President, Xi Jinping. This is a pretty important move because the Vice President of China, unless something goes terribly wrong in the next months, is the next president of China. That's how it works. They have a system where they groom the next leader of the country, the next chairman of the Communist Party, so he will be both. And China now is like the Soviet Union was in the days when I remember state visits. China is, I think, now the second largest economy in the world. It's a booming country, large population, in every respect, a real competitor with the United States in many ways. So his visit to the United States is getting a lot of attention. He's also coming to Iowa. He has an experience in Iowa. He lived here some years ago, and I guess had very fond memories of Iowa, and is coming back. There'll be a big state dinner that Governor Branstad is giving for him. It is at the highest level of a foreign dignitary visiting the state of Iowa that I've ever seen. It is certainly, as the governor has said, as big or bigger than His Holiness the Pope. And Iowa is a strange state in the sense that we're small, we're agricultural, and yet often we are the center of attention and the center of the world. Nikita Khrushchev visited Iowa many years ago in the 1950s. He looked at some farms. He made friends with the Garst family and some other prominent Iowans. And following that, Iowa was always a well-known state in the Soviet Union. It greatly helped us with exchange programs, with exporting, especially agricultural products, to the Soviet Union. And there's a hope that the visit of the Vice President to Iowa will stimulate a lot of business between Iowa and China in the near future, and I believe that that is true. The other thing that we're looking for, of course, is how the United States as a country deals with some of the issues that have become contentious, that have created what you might call sort of tension between China and the United States. One of them is trade relations. The Chinese have artificially deflated their currency so that it is cheap for them to export products, and they therefore are very competitive in the world market, and it's hard for other countries to compete with Chinese products on certain things because they are so inexpensive, in part because of cheap labor, in part because of the devaluation of their currency. And the U.S. would like that corrected. Secondly, China is the source of a tremendous amount of cyber attacks against the United States. It's hard to prove that because internet attacks and probing is so difficult to prove given how the internet works. But there is clear evidence that a very large proportion of that is coming from China testing the Defense Department, testing defense industries in the United States. There's actually an article in the New York Times here today that deals with an American company that basically had its trade secrets stolen, and it's pretty clear that it was a Chinese operation. And that is very troubling because cyber warfare and cyber espionage and also cyber attacks against companies is one of the greatest national security issues in the United States. For private businesses, and I'm teaching a class this semester on electronic democracy, which in part deals with electronic government and electronic voting, but it also deals with the fact that industrial espionage now is rampant. American companies are very vulnerable to having their trade secrets, their blueprints, their business model, everything that a company needs to be successful and competitive, basically stolen through hacking. And this is very, very troubling. And I think President Obama probably should have or will have raised this issue. The Chinese deny it and say, no, we're not involved with that. The other is, of course, that human rights conditions in China are still a little iffy. China is still basically ruled by the Communist Party. There's evidence that the size of the Chinese government, even though they have loosened up and have a private market economy now, has grown, that the government companies actually are taking over more and more of the Chinese economy and playing as if they were private for-profit companies. So it's still a political monopoly, and that's troublesome. There's a lot of concern about working conditions in China and so on. This week, Apple actually has agreed to have some of their factories in China that supply many of the electronic components of iPads, iPhones, other devices, laptops, and so on, inspected, because the suicide rate in some of those factories is phenomenally high. The working conditions are brutal, and the factories actually have big nets all around the building so that when someone jumps out of a window or a balcony to commit suicide, they end up landing in a net the way you would in a circus. I've never heard of anything like that before. It is shocking and appalling, and I think even though we want to have good relations with China, they need to kind of fix those kinds of problems. And finally, there is a real concern about China's building up of its military forces. China is becoming very ambitious. They are launching a navy. They are trying to figure out a way to control a lot of the oceans around China's coast, and in that they are getting into some tense moments with some of their neighbors in the area. You'll remember that there is Japan, and there is Taiwan, and there is, of course, Korea, and some other countries who are afraid of China, frankly, who are worried about China. And what's interesting is that President Obama this year actually suddenly launched what I would call the Pacific Initiative, saying that the United States is involved in the Middle East, yes, and the United States has great relations with Europe, but the U.S. is a Pacific country, just like China or Japan or any of the others. We face the Pacific. We have an enormous coastline. We have a huge amount of trade in the Pacific. And so the United States has suddenly ramped up its involvement in the Pacific. The U.S. is going to be putting some American troops in Australia to train with Australian forces. Interestingly enough, the Iowa Air National Guard actually had an exercise in Australia with the Australian Air Force. Of course, that Air National Guard unit is now threatened to be eliminated in Des Moines and replaced with a unit that will fly drones, which is part of the cutback on the U.S. military. But in any case, Iowa is very happy to welcome the Vice President of China. We hope our relations are good and that we can trade with each other, and also that we can address some of the issues of mutual concern that are quite large, and that if they deteriorate, kind of threaten to put the U.S. and China into the same sort of head-butting relationship that we had with the Soviet Union for about 50 or 60 years. Whether that's inevitable or not, I don't know, but it would be unfortunate. I must say the Chinese are very determined. The Chinese are even more determined, focused, and hard bargainers than the Soviets ever were. So my own view is that China is not going to be an easy partner to reach agreement with, and that the United States is going to have to gird its loins, as they used to say, and make sure that we essentially protect our own national interest, that we secure the cyber environment, the internet environment, and everything that is cyberspace, because that is one of our biggest vulnerabilities, and especially vis-a-vis the Chinese. Very interesting issues coming up with China this week. This is Steffen Schmidt for InsiderIowa.com.